Very warm welcome, everybody, to this open lecture hall, Stockholm plus 50, 5 decades of global environmental governance. My name is Lena Partsch. I'm professor of comparative politics at the Otto Suhr Institute, and I organized this public lecture series to take stock with you of now 5 decades of global environmental governance. And today's lecture deals with multi-stakeholder partnerships, which are often seen as a key instrument to implement a sustainable development. So for me, it's a great honor to welcome Philipp Pattberg and Montserrat Koloffon from VU Amsterdam. They will talk about their research on partnerships today in our lecture. I organized this lecture together with several students, including Emmanuel. And before the floor is yours, Philipp and Montserrat, Emmanuel is going to introduce you. And Philipp and Montserrat said that they will split their talk. So Philipp will first talk for about 20 minutes, and then we all have the chance to ask questions already. And then Montserrat will continue for about another 20 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A session together. Okay, Emmanuel.
Thank you very much, Lena. Welcome everybody to this lecture. Today we have the immense pleasure to receive Professor Philipp Pattberg, as well as Mrs. Montserrat Koloffon Rosas. Mr. Pattberg is the director of the Amsterdam Sustainability Institute, which is a platform for interdisciplinary research at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. He is also acting as the head of the Department of Environmental Policy Analysis. Mr. Pattberg is a professor of Transnational Environmental Governance and Policy, with a focus, among others, on the governance of climate change, biodiversity, transnational relations, public-private partnerships, network theory, and institutional analysis. Mrs. Koloffon is a PhD researcher at the Department of Environmental Policy Analysis of the Institute for Environmental Studies of the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. Her research focuses on international environmental regimes and with a special focus on the study of sustainable development goals of the Agenda 2030. And both researchers have a focus on the options existing for institutional innovation in the context of increased institutional complexity, in particular in environmental governance. So I'm personally very excited to receive these guests, and we as an audience are very lucky to receive inputs from such qualified experts. They deserve our full attention, and we are also very happy to have a dynamic discussion after the presentations. Please, Mr. Pattberg.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Manuel, for the very warm welcome and the very good summary of what I believe is my too long CV. I should shorten it so that when people introduce it's not that long. Yeah, let me just say also, actually, yeah, we're here together. So very nice, Montserrat, that you could join me here today. I'm very excited. I was really looking forward to actually traveling to Berlin. I should tell you, I did my PhD at the Vrije Universiteit. So I'm German by origin, and I did my PhD actually in Berlin. So I know the premises very well. I was looking forward to going to the Henry Ford Bau and walking through the halls and maybe visiting the OSI and the FFU, the Environmental Policy Research Center, where Lena now is a professor, but for some private reasons, I couldn't make it. And I'm really a bit sad about it because I really enjoyed my time there, which I realized is already 20 years ago. I was actually thinking, Lena, probably we met roughly 19 years ago for the first time, where I remember we might have met before, but I remember we were both invited at a conference on basically globalization and the environment. And I actually gave a talk in YouTube basically on partnerships. And I just realized that that's sort of 20 years ago. And I was wondering this morning, what did we learn in those 20 years? And I will talk a little bit about that. And I'm not super happy about everything we learned. I think we could have done more, but I'm also actually, we did learn a bit, so that's fine. So I have something to share. So I think we did an okay job. Okay, having said all of this, so we will talk about the chapter that we have prepared for a project that Lena is running. Some of you here in this course know it, but anyone who's joining the live stream might not. But I also want to thank you for actually paying attention to our chapter, and yeah, that's very much appreciated. And it's really work in progress, as you will also see from the presentation. But we think we have a really interesting research question and a very relevant one, and I want to talk a little bit about this. But first, I need to share, and because this is a different software, I hope it works out. So let me see how we do this. So if everything goes well, you should see my presentation now, and it's a slide with Lego blocks. Is that right?
Yeah, it works very well.
Okay. You might wonder why Lego, and I mean, there's lots of stories to that. But so basically, we want to talk about the SDGs today. And we want to talk about multi-stakeholder partnerships, so-called MSPs, that could actually be a sort of way to make the relatively loosely coupled SDGs much more coherent. So in other words, to move from a block of Legos to something which makes sense. And why that is really important is because the SDGs are, from their setup, these 17 goals in the 2030 agenda, they're meant to be working together, but they have been set up in silos. And that's a sort of contradiction, because a lot of talk in the run-up to the SDGs was about that everything hangs together, but then in the end they said, yeah, we make 17 boxes and lots of indicators. And so one question was always, how do you make sure that we not work on silos, but we actually make sure we can integrate some of those problems and solutions? And many people argue that there are many ways to do this, but one is to use a collaborative approach where you bring in different sectors. That's what we call multi-stakeholder partnerships. So we want to discuss that proposition, because this is actually an hypothesis, because we don't really know if that works. So that's what we try to find out. Can MSPs act as something like a Nexus facilitator for the SDGs? Okay, and how we're going to do that is basically taking 3 steps. First of all, very quickly getting you into the mood, and I will talk a little bit about the context of all of this. You're probably very familiar. And then I will take a look back in the last 20 years and report a little bit on the state of the art. And then we spend some time on what we believe to be a really important research frontier, and that is the governance nexus and the question of synergies. How can you actually produce synergies between the SDGs and those problems solutions to those problems that we see? So we'll talk about a research project that we currently engaged in, Montserrat and me, together with some colleagues in Stockholm and some other Swedish universities, with a researcher that some of you might have come across in reading about this, Karen Beckstrand. So really interesting research that we're doing there. And we will report on that, basically what became the chapter. Okay. Let me jump right into the context. I'm sure you don't need much of an introduction, but just to say that the current environmental crisis, which is not only about climate change or only about biodiversity or only about plastic pollution, it's about all of those things and many more. And at the same time, pressing social justice issues about poverty and inclusiveness have led the international community to agreeing on the 2015 SDGs. And I will not discuss today whether the SDGs are actually a really good idea, because recently has a lot of criticism emerged about whether we should actually continue with that. I'm not going to do that now. And just say from the beginning, the SDGs and the 2030 agenda were an international UN agenda, but always with a focus on both governments as being main parts of that, and each government, not just the global south, also developed countries, and also really focusing on the local implementation. And when you think about that challenge, then really a lot of people immediately realize that you cannot do that if you just ask governments to do that alone. Because if that were so easy, governments probably would have solved all these problems a long time ago. So there's this idea that you need to bring in all actors, other actors, and sort of all hands on deck. And again, I'm not saying that is without criticism, but that's sort of a feeling that was there quite strongly. And I will also show you in a second that this is not new, but it goes back really decades, this idea of collaboration. Okay, good. The SDGs have they're numbered, and SDG 17 talks about the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development. And in that part, in SDG 17, there's actually really concrete reference to so-called multi-stakeholder partnerships. For example, in 1716, the text talks about that multi-stakeholder partnerships are there to mobilize knowledge and technology and financial resources to support the achievement of the SDGs. So MSPs, multi-stakeholder partnerships, have a specific, concrete place in the entire setup of the SDGs as one of the mechanisms through which the SDGs should be realized. And that's really important to remember. So the SDGs are not something that we scientists made up or that we just talk about because we think it's so interesting. It's something that is in the SDG and the 2030 framework itself. So also in the policy document, Transforming Our World, you find reference to this idea of partnership. And I just want to emphasize that this is a non-trivial question. In particular, in times as these, where we see that actually global politics can be quite conflictive, the idea to collaborate isn't so, how should I say? I mean, it's quite something if you think about it. And it takes a lot of effort to actually collaborate. So we shouldn't take that for granted. So I just want to flag that this idea of multi-stakeholderism is in the SDGs themselves. Good. There has been quite some scholarship, as I will show in a second, so none of this is really new, but as I already mentioned, it is not, we cannot take it for granted that it works out. So we always need to think about the context in which it can work and what could be improved about it if we really want to advance this as a policy tool. There are lots of definitions, I'm sure you know many of them, and I'm not necessarily a fan of definitions per se. I mean, it's not about right and wrong, rather about useful. But usually we would understand those multi-stakeholder partnerships as sort of interactions which are institutionalized, so not spontaneous, but they follow some rules, right, between public and private actors that aim to provide collective goods, public goods, right? So it's not about private interests per se, it's about public interests. Okay. Now, having said that, I just want to be also very clear that none of what we say today is per se an endorsement of any specific MSPs or the general idea, in fact, because you can be very critical about it. The role of the scientist, in my eyes, should be to evaluate MSPs and to tell us, do they work, under what conditions do they work, can they be improved, but also really to understand that they might be a second or third best option. You know, when you ask me, I would, of course, like that there wouldn't be any problem in the first place, because we realized that we shouldn't continue an exploitive development paradigm, or maybe that states would have done what they are supposed to do in all their constitutions and just deliver on that, but they don't. So you can say, yeah, it's a second best, and we need to analyze it nonetheless. Now, there are, as in any good debate, different sides. One that is relatively positive and really focusing on this idea that multi-stakeholder partnerships can be both action-oriented, on the ground, but also really bring in this additional knowledge, skills, but also resources, right? And that's crucially important when you think about the SDGs, because they touch on so many complex problems that actually thinking that any one agency would know how to deal with them is really not correct. So that's one way you can look at them and then understand that many observers are quite positive. But there's also the other side, which focuses a lot on the potential of this being a blue washing exercise, right? Blue washing referring to using the UN and the UN colors to basically make you look better, right? When companies join partnerships, maybe they do that just because of those considerations, but also partnerships potentially being a Western sort of paradigm, right? When you just think about this as an ideal setup of how society looks like, government, markets, civil society, not every society would actually recognize this as a good description of what a society is. So this might be very Western biased, actually. So there might be these problems in there that have been discussed a lot. So this is just to say, that there is debate and that also we are not necessarily endorsing partnerships per se, but we want to understand them. Okay, and that is why I have in my career engaged in quite some research on them, and will not tell you all of it, but just very briefly getting you up to date on what you could consider the state of the art. And there are three, I think, really interesting questions here that I will briefly touch upon. First, how pervasive are those multi-stakeholder partnerships? So actually, are there just a few? We talk a lot about them. Maybe there are really lots of them. We don't talk about them enough, or there are lots of them and we talk about them just the right amount. And I also want to talk a little bit about the research that has been done on effectiveness. So do they work, and under what conditions do they work? And finally, briefly refer to some thoughts about how they could be potentially improved. So what is the cooking recipe to make a good multi-stakeholder partnership? And I do this all to show you that we have advanced quite a bit in research, but that there is really an interesting frontier. And we will come to that because that's the second part of today's presentation. All right. Yeah, by the way, if there's anything unclear or you have a question, you can also, for those at least that can do that, come in the chat or something. So the first question, how pervasive are those multi-stakeholder partnerships? There are a couple of ways to look at that. But one thing I really want to say is they are not new. In fact, already in 1992, at the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development in Rio, and the Agenda 21, one of the outcomes of that summit, there was talk about partnerships as a necessary tool to get things done. And 10 years later, at the so-called World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg, partnerships were actually the main tangible outcome of that summit. For those of you who might be a bit younger or don't remember, that was really briefly after September 11th. That's when these planes flew in the World Trade Center and other places, and people were concerned with totally different questions. And so when states met in Johannesburg, environment and development wasn't really on anyone's agenda. So they couldn't agree on any binding, law-making international law. So instead, what they said is, let's do type 2. And type 2 actually refers to what happens when you not make some multilateral treaty, because that's type 1 in their lingo. So they said type 2 is what we do, which is actually partnerships. And it was really interesting. So they asked all sorts of actors to come together and register public-private partnerships. And that was the main outcome of that summit, which is really important to remember. So it's since then that we have this as a key tool in the toolbox for international sustainable development. Now, that's also really nice because we could do a lot of research on those initial 300-something partnerships, and I will talk a little bit about that. So how pervasive? Yeah, they're there for a long time, and they're all over the place. So there are a lot of different databases out there. One is actually maintained by the UN itself, and we will talk about that later, but it has some 6,000 entries. And it's really hard to estimate how many of those entries would be multi-stakeholder partnerships or how many partnerships might be there outside of any registry. So we can only assume that there might be tens of thousands of multi-stakeholder partnerships on sustainability issues alone, which is a lot if you think about it. Good. Let me move quickly to the really interesting question, probably. Do they work? Effectiveness. And here, I want to introduce you to a key lesson learned if you're a political scientist, any social scientist, and that's, it depends. Because it really depends on what you mean with effectiveness. And there are lots of different frameworks out there and colleagues that talk about different ways of thinking about that. So it's not a straightforward answer that I can give. So I need to specify it a little bit. And I just want to remind you all that it's a non-trivial question because there are a lot of different ways it has been operationalized. So some people talk about something like more efficiency, where they talk about the ratio between what you put in and what you get out. And that's really relevant for some. Then there are colleagues who talk actually about effectiveness as problem solving, which depends, of course, what is your problem? Then people are concerned with qualities such as legitimacy or, democratic decision-making, which might be more at the procedural level. And then some others have argued that probably anything you do has consequences, either intended consequences, so you want to make the world a better place and make it more participatory, more just and fair, in addition to solving all sorts of problems. But some others also reminded us that there might be unintended consequences, right? So you might be actually not thinking about something and it might still happen. And that might be positive. Actually, then you have a synergy, or it might be negative. Yeah, and then you have a problem. So all of this is there to keep in mind when we talk about, do they work? And also to make it even a bit more complicated, you might think about, do they work at the level of individual multi-stakeholder partnerships, right? Or at the level of all the partnerships that exist, and then thinking of them as a policy approach, which is a different question. Okay. Having said that, I will not bore you with all the answers on all of those different ways to do it, but I will focus on two really interesting questions that I think are good illustrations of what we know about whether multi-stakeholder partnerships work. The first one is picking up on a debate that is still very prominent, and that is that these partnerships fill gaps that were left behind or are left behind by public policymaking, right? Because if you think about it, if states would just solve all problems, there would be no need for public-private partnerships, basically. So then there seems to be a gap in what we deliver through international agreements, for example, and so the idea would be that those partnerships come in and close those gaps. And then we'll talk about what we know about that happening. The second thing I will tell you is, do they actually solve problems? Are they effective in that sense? And that's based on some research that I've done with colleagues. So there might be other opinions on that. And I will have some references so you can read that for yourself if you don't believe me in a second. Okay, so talking about this idea of multi-stakeholder partnerships closing a governance gap, so to speak, one really interesting proposition, I think, is that they would basically lead to more participation. And that's quite easy to see why that could be the case, right? Because if you bring in an NGO and a company together with a governmental agency, you basically bring in actors that might not have been around before. So this idea that multi-stakeholder partnerships actually enhance participation in global governance was a very strong idea, and normatively positive, I guess. People like that idea. But is it actually true? And the answer is, by and large, no. Because most partnerships that have been studied so far, and they range really in the hundreds and probably thousands, showed again and again that most partnerships are dominated by government agencies, in particular those situated in the global north. So let's say OECD type of countries. Okay? I will show you just as an illustration a couple of slides on that. Don't try to read the fine print here, but what this shows is that partnerships that we have studied were led by either states or UN organizations or some other international organizations. So they were not driven by non-governmental organizations, nor were they mainly driven by business. And you could say that's a good thing, right? So I'm just reporting this as a result. Also, when you think about where the agencies that participate in these multi-stakeholder partnerships, where they actually come from, what you see is a strong bias towards the OECD world, which means that there are certain countries that pop up all the time: Germany, France, the UK, Sweden. Not a surprise, but it's really important to acknowledge that. There's a really strong bias towards a certain type of northern country. And also this idea that in general, there would be more representation of maybe marginalized groups is by and large not correct. So in all the partnerships that we study, we see this picture again and again that women, indigenous people, trade unions, farmers, the youth are underrepresented. While actually the typical actors, that's governments, business actors, NGOs, and international agencies are strongly represented. So what that means in a nutshell is that this idea that multi-stakeholder partnerships basically bring in these new actors and sort of close a participatory gap in global policymaking is not really correct. Okay, you might say, well, what about solving problems? Because maybe you're not so concerned about participation, but about whether they actually solve problems. And we also did research on that, and I'm just gonna tell you also there, no, they don't really solve problems all the way. They do it a bit. I'm not gonna go too much into how that has been measured, but basically what we found again and again is that there are lots of partnerships that don't do anything, which is surprising because why would they be there? And even those that do something, that have tangible activities, we found that many of those activities are not really matched to what they actually try to do. And just to give you a simple example, if you want to become fit, right? If you want to, increase your health, then I would expect you to maybe go running in the park or go to the gym or eat healthy. But if you go to the pub, I would say, maybe that's not helpful, right? And that's the same here. So what we found in a lot of research is that they do something, but it doesn't really seem to fit what they actually try to do, which is why there are lots of question marks about the motives of partnerships in the first place. Okay, short summary. So the picture is a bit mixed. And I'm talking a lot about the aggregate level, not about individual partnerships. They might be great. But on the aggregate level, we were a bit disappointed, to be honest, about the potential of partnerships to solve all sorts of problems. Now, that's why a third solid, let's say, research outcome over the last 10, 15 years was, how can they be actually improved? Right? I mean, that's sort of logical, right? When you find that things don't really work, then scientists tend to say, but how could we design them better? How could we tinker with them? And I think that's really relevant. So I just want to share this with you. This is one framework of many frameworks that try to figure out what are the success factors of partnerships that work. And so what could you learn from those? And I just leave it with this slide to tell you that, there are lots of factors. And so it's not simple, but there are things that we know that work. Right? You need leadership, you need the right partners, you need stable funding, good management, all these kind of things, which already indicates that actually having a working, successful partnership is not a trivial thing to do. Okay? So what does this leave us with? It leaves us with, and that was really just pressing in everything in 50 minutes, a good knowledge base in 2022 to say, well, multi-stakeholder partnerships might be relevant, but they didn't yet reach their full potential. So when we focus our attention now on the SDGs and the question, what is the role of partnerships in actually achieving the 2030 agenda, then we should keep those things in mind. All right, if you want to read a bit more, some references here, probably we can share the slides in some way or so. So there's a lot of research that you can check out, and it basically shows what I just reported. Now, it leaves us in a way with the question, okay, so what are we going to do now? Both in research, but also in practice. And we will tell you a bit what we think is actually a really important question. And that question is, well, partnerships might not be ideal and they might not work all the time, but maybe they could do something really important. Maybe they could help us to bridge the silos of the SDGs. Because the SDGs talk about things that are connected, they're logically connected, they're connected in terms of processes, in terms of the biophysical underlying structures. So maybe these partnerships could help us to integrate the SDGs and to produce synergies, right? So that is actually what we now try to figure out after we try to figure out, do they work and how can they be improved? And that is where we are currently working on. And that is what Montserrat will talk to you about in the next part, but not before I ask you, are there any questions you might have on this? Anything that's unclear, anything you disagree with, or just something you want to ask me now? There's also time to do that later, obviously, but now is a good time because we will move into the research frontier in a second. So, time for you to ask a question if you like.
I just want to mention that people on the live stream can also ask their questions through the chat function, or there is a question and answer function, and then we will read the questions here.
Excellent. Okay, so if not, then I hand over to my colleague Montserrat.
I do see a hand from Ruth.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, I'm a little worried about my headphones, but okay, thank you. Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. I was wondering regarding this idea of improvement of partnerships and this little like half and half outcome, since it's like it has been ineffective to deal with these partnerships in some cases. And to put a little provocative, like, why is there still the need to research them? And is there more potential to be unlocked? Because I was wondering how you see your role of your research and all that, and if there is hope for the idea of partnerships instead of focusing on this first option of partnerships that rather aims for state governance. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really relevant question. I try to sort of already answered in my remarks a bit. I mean, of course, you could say there's a lot of criticism, and so most of theoretically, all sorts of problems that could be there, capture and blue and greenwashing. So, and then what I just said, being mixed picture. So why talk about this at all? Because we could just talk about something different. And I agree we could, but the problem is twofold. One is partnerships are in the agenda mentioned as a way to do it. So there's a lot of attention on them. Actually, there's 6,000 registered partnerships in the UN platform. So people are busy with this. So they're spending money and time on that. So then should we just ignore that? And the other question is, well, who you focus on then? Because again, I mean, I'm theoretically, I'm a statist. I would like governments to do what they're supposed to do, but they don't. So if they don't, then we are back to the second best or third best or maybe fourth best option. And that's why I think it is relevant to discuss what partnerships can do, because first, they are there, they're operating, they take up a lot of resources and a lot of resources basically of lots of people. But they're also actually potentially able to do things that we weren't able to do. And one of those things indeed is to create a nexus between different policy areas, because that's really a big problem, as we will hopefully explain. And that will be the reason why I think we need research on them. But doing research doesn't mean you actually normatively support it, right? Or when you do research on war, it doesn't mean that, so you try to figure it out. And so in a similar way, I would say this is really totally neutral. So our position is normatively neutral on partnerships. Good, but maybe some of those questions will be answered when we move into that part of the nexus. Montserrat.
Yeah, there's one more hand. I don't know if we should address it or if I should.
Sure.
Yeah, Marin.
Yes, so hello, thank you again for your talk. Can you hear me? Okay. I was wondering regards to the MSP, and probably it will be answered next. So if it's so, maybe we can skip the question. But the MSP seems to address more governmental and business actions mainly. And you already said that NGOs are not so much represented in MSPs. But I was wondering, like, why and what role civil society and NGOs can actually play in this partnerships, and how they can be probably better involved, how the partnerships could be improved.
Yeah. So maybe that is a bit imprecise in my account. So no, NGOs are part, and most MSPs in the strict definition are always tripartite. So they're always a public actor and a non-profit and a profit actor, basically. So in a very strict sense, they have those non-governmental interests in there. But that doesn't mean they would represent certain marginalized interests, like trade unions or women or youth, or because the question is obviously who does a global NGO like WWF or Greenpeace actually represent? So just having civil society, which is also a broad concept, included, does not necessarily mean you have all interests included. And that was a bit what I tried to report on the participation bit. But no, NGOs are on board very strongly, actually, advocating it in a sense. There are very, very few civil society actors that really object partnering with others these days. Okay. More time for questions later, but I think we should jump a bit into what we've been doing recently. Montserrat, I hand over to you, and I will move the slides on your command.
Yes, thank you. So exactly. So what I'm gonna do in this second half of the lecture is I'm gonna walk you through how these early stages of our new research project looks like. This new research frontier that Philipp was mentioning. Which is partly captured in our chapter, but has also since then evolved. And it may be interesting covering how those approaches have been maturing. So a quick overview is I want to first tell you about the aims of this research project called Transform 2030, the current status of our conceptual framework, and how we have moved on with the operationalization of MSPs, and a little bit on the coding of our own database. And finally, I will conclude with the areas of future research that can be interesting in this area and that can hopefully spark a bit of a discussion among us. So Philipp, maybe we can go to the next slide. Can we go to the next slide?
Yeah, I'm working on it, sorry.
No problem. Yeah, so are we? Oh, sorry. No. Then I think you were already on the. Yeah, sorry. I forgot that was the first one. Okay, so we're both Philipp and I part of this project called Transformative Partnerships 2030, which aims to provide answers to questions surrounding this issue about multi-stakeholder partnerships as a central implementation mechanism to achieve the SDGs. And the question touched on concepts such as synergies among SDGs, effectiveness on different governance levels. Philipp talked a little bit about that. It also evaluates the governance within the MSPs, focusing, for example, on legitimacy, inclusiveness, accountability. And of course, the multi-million-dollar question is the fourth one listed there that puts it all together, sort of, which is how should MSPs be designed and governed to become synergistic, effective, and legitimate in order to implement the 2030 agenda through transformative change. So all of it, right? And as I mentioned, well, this project is quite new. We've been working on it for just over half a year now. And what I want to tell you is a little bit about these early stages of our project and how our approach has been maturing in this short period of time. So now, Philipp, now I do need the next one. So first of all, as you saw from the research questions, there are all these concepts like synergies, effectiveness on different governance levels. And of course, we needed to start by creating a common understanding around how all of them fit together and how they relate to each other. And so in the book chapter, we're talking about multi-stakeholder partnerships as Nexus facilitators. But of course, recognizing that multi-stakeholder partnerships is just one type of vehicle to implement the SDGs. And well, all types of vehicles for implementation should also be able to fit a general conceptual framework. Now we've moved to talk about this concept of governance nexus that you see here. So we understand a governance nexus as it's a lot to take in, but just for a quick overview, we understand this governance nexus as a special type of governance setup, this setup combines goals, practices, discourses, institutions, geographies, all these elements on the left, but also explicitly has the intention to connect two or more issue areas. And then the effects of this governance setup that's kind of where synergies come into play, because synergies is one potential effect that can come out of this setup. But the effects range from synergies, which is a win-win, to trade-offs or neutral, like no observable effects, to conflict, and which could be like a lose-lose situation. And again, as Philipp mentioned on the first part of the presentation, all of this can be observed on different governance levels. Now, so this is like the general framework where we hope many others could fit in. But Philipp, if we go to the next slide, here you can see it a little bit like how it could look if we apply it to what we're focusing on in a research project. So here we see like the multi-stakeholder partnership in the center, combining all these elements, but also SDGs. And so this visualization here shows, just for sakes of illustration, 3 random SDGs, 6, 12, and 15. We in turn decided to focus on our book chapter on SDGs 13, which is climate action, and 15, which is life on land, as a good entry point, just because the need to address these 2 areas together has recently gained a lot of prominence, both on the scientific front, but also in the political mainstream. And now it is more understood that 1, climate change hurts biodiversity. 2, biodiversity is essential to climate mitigation and adaptation. 3, climate change and biodiversity loss share root causes that are in turn related to other SDGs. And 4, some climate mitigation solutions hurt biodiversity. So there are a lot of obvious ways of how these 2 SDGs are really closely interconnected, and there's also recognition about that. So this is our, let's say, our entry point. And so if you go to next slide, Philipp. Of course, to make a first evaluation, we needed data. And we are using Undesa's so-called partnership platform, which is, we could consider it the official registry of multi-stakeholder partnerships working on SDGs implementation within the UN system. There may be other databases that researchers have collected independently and that look beyond these, or maybe managed by other institutions, but this is the one that is like managed by the UN and therefore serves as their official registry. And so, as Philipp mentioned, anyone who has some, what are they calling them here? Voluntary commitment or multi-stakeholder partnership can go to their website and register it voluntarily, let's say, and fill in basically some basic information on the partnership so that the UN has it on the radar. They can provide a website if they have one, they can provide a short description, and they can mention what SDGs they focus on. So we can go to next slide, Philipp. So now I want to go over a little bit what we did for the book chapter and what we're doing for the project in terms of coding. So for the book chapter, we thought, okay, let's just do a first exploration, let's say, of what these multi-stake partnerships are connecting and how that looks. And the cutoff was, we thought, okay, let's focus on multi-stakeholder partnerships that are working on a maximum, like declare. They basically click when they're filling in their form. They click the SDGs that they consider that are in their focus. We thought, let's take the ones that are focusing on a maximum of 4 sustainable development goals, of which 2 are SDGs 13 and 15. So we can argue that they're mainly working on climate and biodiversity, or at least it's like a big part of their focus. But we did take their focus at face value. So we basically believe that what they're declaring to be the SDGs in their focus is actually what they're focusing on, but we're not double checking on that. And then we also have only an ex post check of their composition. So are they really a multi-stakeholder partnerships? We're not checking that. We're sort of just saying, okay, let's take everything that's in there, and when we dig in a little bit deeper, we'll find out if this is actually a multi-stakeholder partnership or just someone else who randomly registered something that is not a multi-stakeholder partnership. Now, to address some of the weaknesses of this first early approach, for the project, we're no longer, let's say, having this focus-based cutoff. But now we have several criteria that must be fulfilled in order for the entries to be included in our sample. And I can talk a little bit more about that if you're interested, but it's just a lot of detailed criteria that have to do with the definition of what we understand to be a multi-stakeholder partnership. So also, we thought just taking their declared SDGs as, you know, face value for what they're actually focusing on is a bit of a weak approach. So what we're doing now, or what we did, is we built these SDG dictionaries, which are a set of words that serve as indicators pointing to a certain SDG. So if certain obvious terms appear in their descriptions, we then consider them to focus on a certain SDG. And we're doing this with an automated approach. So we're using web scraping, and then we run those dictionaries, and then, oops, I stopped seeing the slides. I don't know if you're also having that issue. I also stopped seeing Philipp, so I don't know if...
I think, Philipp, you need to reload the presentation.
Worst case scenario, maybe I can also manage to share the slides. But I don't know if Philipp can hear us. Oh, I think Philipp dropped out. Should I try to share the slides?
Yeah, please.
Let's see. I guess we were here. Can you see
Perfect.
this?
Yes,
And
we
then
can see
this
it.
is the presenter's view. You can see now, right?
Perfect.
Okay, great. I'm glad. But where was I? Yeah, so basically we're running these dictionaries on the descriptions of the registry, and we are no longer saying, okay, the thing is, there are some tendencies to you know, have this belief that more is better, and therefore let us check everything. We're doing all the things. But instead, we're not checking, okay, what are they declaring that they're working on? And if they're not having the word climate, but they are ticking climate change, then maybe they're not doing anything, or any of the other related terms, right? Then we don't trust that they are working on that. And now we're doing this ex ante check of their composition, so they're only included in our sample if it really fulfills all the criteria for being a multi-stakeholder partnership. So now I need to see how to change this slide. Yes, exactly. So let's see. Yeah. So we worked, as you can see, with a rather small data sample with some weaknesses, acknowledged weaknesses, but still with this data we have a couple of interesting findings. And I should mention there are findings that were actually key in order to further develop our current coding approach that we're taking in the project. So first I want to start with this mapping or network of the SDGs that are covered by, let's say, entries in the partnership platform that have this criteria of working on both SDGs 13 and 15. That's why if you see in the bottom SDGs 13 and 15, those have both 65, because obviously all of them are working on those two, so they all are counted in. But an interesting trend here is that, for example, we find that all SDGs are included in at least one entry in our sample, except SDG 10, which is reduced inequalities. And so that one is not featured by any combination in our sample. And SDG 9 is only included by a single entry. That one is on industry, innovation, and infrastructure. And then on the other hand, for example, we have SDG 14, which is the most frequently featured by the entries in our sample. Now, this makes a lot of theoretical sense. So it's like a good a trend to see, let's say, because we are, after all, talking about climate and biodiversity. And SDG 14, which is life underwater, is also about biodiversity. So maybe we can say, okay, so these multi-stakeholder partnerships seem to have this theoretical understanding of biodiversity in the wider sense of biodiversity, not only land-based biodiversity, let's say. Now, unfortunately, if you look at this bar chart on the graph, this is a screenshot that I took from the partnership platform that reports the frequency of SDGs as covered by the MSPs registered, or not MSPs, but by the any sort of commitment registered on the platform. And if you pay attention, SDGs 9 and 10, which are the lowest in this mapping of our sample, are also the least featured goals overall in the entire partnership platform. And SDGs 14, which is the one that we were happy to see that was featured a lot, is also the one that is featured the most overall in the partnership platform. So this is, let's say, you know, a weakness that points to the fact that we need more sophisticated analyses to provide more like inferential, let's say, analysis to see if these connections point to something else other than just correlation. Some other findings. So this is, let's say, this is like a bit of a fun mapping we did to just understand the constellation of SDGs as they are connected by MSPs working on climate and biodiversity nexus. You know, like a few, let's say, hopeful findings would be that multi-stakeholder, or like the entries that fall in our sample, do focus on multiple goals at a time, which is what we would expect, as Philipp was mentioning. Like, do they help bridge these silos? Yeah, and so this is what's shown here. The colorful ones on the right graph are the ones that are mapped on the left. But we also find quite some limitations, and that includes that many. So first, not all of them are multi-stakeholder partnerships. Now, of course, we are addressing that with our coding for the project. Here, we just took everything at face value, and then only when we looked in more detail into them, we noticed that not all of them have the setup that we understand to be for an MSP. Then many also don't provide enough information. We know very little about them from their description, and then they fail to provide a website. And if they don't have a website, then there's nothing else we can do to learn about them. And another weakness that we spotted is that most entries are relatively small. So let's say the big and well-established partnerships that we know that are working on biodiversity and climate are not included in in UNDESA's registry. So yeah, I guess we could maybe discuss more about why this is the case. We have a few hypotheses. It could be that they don't know about it, so it could be that UNDESA has not done enough, has not marketed itself good enough for them to know. Maybe they don't see an added value on being registered there, or maybe only the small ones see an added value on it. Maybe it is also just a burden, or the actual platform is a little bit buggy, so maybe it really doesn't work as intended. But this is yeah, we can discuss more on these afterwards. Just to finish off, I would like to talk a little bit about what can be expected as future research within our project. So first and foremost, we're working currently to do more to come up with a more complete mapping of the multi-stakeholder partnerships connecting SDGs, which needs methods on like large N network, large N analysis and network analysis for mapping. But of course, well, that goes on the one hand. On the other hand, we need more detailed small N studies, both for understanding what is going on inside those MSPs, the actual functions and activities, day-to-day activities, so that we can have a more solid understanding of these pathways that potentially lead to synergies, to synergistic implementation of SDGs, and also case studies to have more thorough effectiveness evaluations. Then our colleagues from Sweden will focus also on the legitimacy and accountability of partnerships, which is more of a normative evaluation. And then last but not least, our project also is aiming to provide this like meta governance of MSPs policy recommendations. So like this more like orchestration type of recommendations so that MSPs can really work for transformation to sustainability. So yeah, I hope you found this interesting and a little bit insightful of how the early stages of a research project look like. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen.
Yes, hello, thank you again also for your talk. It was really insightful. And actually, I am quite interested in the criteria you choose for your MSPs. If it doesn't take too much time, I think that's also what I wanted to ask earlier, what I wanted to, yeah. And like how you define it and what criteria you take, and probably also like what role NGOs play in your definitions and your evaluation of the MSPs.
Yes, I'm happy to talk about that. And as I do, I was actually trying to pull out a slide that visualizes how we're doing it, because we have a bit of a like a decision tree. So we started from taking one of the most established definitions on the literature for what a multi-stakeholder partnership is. But of course, even if the definition is very clear, that doesn't mean that you can immediately, like go ahead and code according to that. You need to operationalize the definition, and that's what we've done. Let me see if I can find. Well, anyway, but we have like for these yeah, we kind of came up with criteria that match that definition. That is depending on like the sectors. So for it to be considered a multi-stakeholder partnership, it must include at least 2 different sectors. Then there's also the question on where, because we're talking about, we have this thing about like transnational multi-stakeholder partnerships. So you can find a multi-stakeholder partnership that operates, that has two sectors, let's say, but they're both, let's say, to illustrate it, let's say you have a German NGO and a German state agency, but they're both German and they're maybe also operating, so they're operating inside of Germany. And so for that does not fit our sample because we are focusing on transboundary MSPs, but we code them as well. We have this sort of like checklist approach where we code them just in case we want to go back and look into them at some point in the future, but it's not the focus of our research project. And then the last criterion is about the governance aspect. So it can not only be like a commitment or just, some of them are a bit like PR talk, just like, oh, yeah, we want to do this and that, and we're really good because of this and that, stuff like that. Yeah, initiatives, projects, these things, we do find many of those that are registered, but that are not, basically they don't have like a clear governance of the partnership itself, a steering committee or something that that makes it more like an established institutionalized body. So I don't know if let me see. I did find the slide. I don't know if I should show it, Philipp.
If you found it, show it.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, then let me go again into sharing my screen. Share. Here it is. So here you can see the definition, right? And then we have sort of like these two criteria are applied automatically. So if they don't provide a website, we don't include them. If they in our sample, if they don't cover or they don't target more than 2 SDGs, those two criteria are great because they're applied automatically. Then they're immediately out of our sample. But this is manually coded. We go through each one of the entries, we read their descriptions, we read the information they provide basically, and then we check. And only the ones that manage to fulfill all the criteria, like check all the boxes, those are included in your sample. And the others are coded accordingly to what they do, what they do and they don't. But yeah, we not necessarily include them in our sample. And I don't know if you had a second part of your question. Otherwise, I hope this was clear.
That was clear, thank you. I was just wondering if you have like some first results or if you find some partnerships more, like is there more partnerships between private and public or private and NGOs or NGOs and governments?
So right now, this coding that we're doing, you can see like two phases of coding. The first one is coding, but it's just to delimit our sample. So it's just to find out which of all the things that are registered there, which are actually MSPs and which are something else. But then the second round of coding is actually then coding more specific variables about these MSPs. And that's when we go into more detail of like, okay, what are the actors that are involved and what types of actors are involved here, etc. Right now, as soon as we can find that 2 different sectors are participating, we code it in. And then let's say we figure out later which are those, and then we code that more in more detail. So we don't have yet data on that, but that's coming up.
Yes, Laura, or if Maren, if it's directly related to the answer, maybe you want to rebound on it?
No, I'm just trying to find out how to put my hand back.
Okay. So, Laura, it's your turn, please.
Maybe more generally, like what do you expect to be the advantages of such a platform? Like, are companies or any kind of stakeholders expected to rather create partnerships because such a platform exists? Or also regarding the future studies, like is there a plan of a qualitative study from potential stakeholders, what they would need to, or what they would want to create more MSPs? Thank you.
So this is a really good question, Montserrat. I'll take this one just briefly if you want to add. But so one thing to keep in mind is there's probably much more sort of partnerships around than we know of, right? So because it seems to be a quite logical way to operate in some circumstances to get sort of complementary expertise in. And one example is there are probably thousands of national domestic partnerships in many countries that we don't know of because we don't really study them. Right? So, and when you go back a bit in time in the 1980s, people were talking about public-private partnerships, and what they meant were partnerships between the business and the public sector to deliver water services, for example. So this is a really old discussion. But what the UN did in the context of the 2030 agenda, and that's what we talk about here today, is they said what we need is a registry so that anyone who is doing a partnership could come on board, and so that we build that learning platform. Right. One idea, of course, why you want to have a registry is that you can learn from each other. But it was also meant to incentivize actors to come on board. I'm not sure if it was meant to have anyone set up a partnership so that they could register it. That doesn't seem really like useful. But it was more to incentivize actors to communicate about it, right? And that has basically brought the problem that we have discussed a bit, that not all of the things on the platform are really public-private partnerships in a scientific sense. Many of the things are simply anyone who's doing something coming there and showcasing it, because this is like window dressing, because they want to show the world that they're doing it. In addition, you have to understand the UN logic. They focus on various things throughout, their agenda. And for example, in 2014, there was an ocean summit. And when this ocean summit came along, the UN said, anyone doing anything on oceans, come and register it. That actually explains why there's a lot of partnerships on oceans in there. So the whole point here is that what we do here is we do research on a policy platform, right? So that's not unbiased in the first place. So you have to understand some of those reasons why it is there and how it's operating. So we're not claiming that this is sort of a representative sample of anything, because it's really a UN policy tool that we try to analyze, right? So that's really important to keep in mind. So I think that's a bit how they set it up, is as a showcasing mechanism and a learning mechanism. And what we now try to find out is if that allows actually partnerships to link SDGs to overcome the silos, which is something that we hypothesize about that we don't really know. And so the preliminary stuff that we showed you today is, yeah, there are linkages. And now the next step is to figure out how actually the synergies could come about. Is that there's different ideas how that could theoretically happen, right? And that's really, I think, interesting. Also for anyone who's actually doing research or wants to do research, really go into that and try to figure that out. How do partnerships create synergies on the ground, right? Is it because different people from different sectors talk to each other? Is it because they realize that one approach fits two purposes, right? Like planting trees is good for biodiversity and climate if you do it the right way, these kind of things. Or is it really just by making sure that you talk to each other, that you never did that before, right? So partnerships might just create these fora where people exchange ideas and many others. So that's what we try to figure out. But keep in mind, it's a policy platform, right? It's sort of, it's totally biased from the start, basically.
Yeah, I did want to add something to that, and that is that like that in itself can be an entire line of research that is not our line of research. So like how these platforms are working, and if the platform itself is being effective for what it was intended to do, etc. And maybe what are the gaps that can be filled in there? So my co-PhD and I always talk about this thing of like, well, partnerships actually, or like actors, potential partners in partnerships need some sort of like Tinder for partnerships where you can sort of like, go out and see who's there and see who you can collaborate with for what, etc. And that is an actual tool for like partnership formation, etc., right? But this here, it's just more of a passive, let's say, a passive compilation of MSPs that the UN has, and yeah, and who knows if everyone is aware of, and yeah, and then a whole nother story is to question what the UN wants to get out of it and what it is actually getting out of it.
Yes, Felix?
Yes, thank you. I'm also thinking about the lectures that we seen before in this series. And what I heard a lot was that there needs to be more integration in these fields to have effective governance. Like there should be the local level, the national level, the international level, economic actors, NGOs. And now after reading your chapter and also listening to your talk, I see like that there's a big complexity in these multi-stakeholder partnerships, and it's not as easy as bring everyone together and it will work. So I'm wondering if there's maybe like a kind of limit to that integration, if there's a limit to how many actors can participate. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really a great question. I mean, it directs our attention to some of the probably the normative biases that we might have, right? Because when you say, hey, let's collaborate, that sounds good. And there are very few people who say, no, let's not do that. But of course, collaboration takes time. It can go wrong. You can collaborate about the wrong things, right? So let's think there's a partnership between lots of actors that try to put a price on carbon. You might still think a price on carbon is not the right thing to do. So all of this said, you're right in the sense that collaboration has its limits because it is very time consuming, costs a lot of resources. However, on the other hand, what we also do see is there isn't that much collaboration. There's much fewer than you would expect, in particular when we talk about the silos again. I mean, just having said what we said about some of the things that are underrepresented, right? I could go on and share some other data. We did recently look at the entire output of my university in terms of our research across the SDGs, and guess which SDGs are really very low on research. It's gender equality, it's poverty, it's inclusion, it's these kind of things that are under researched. And that already shows again that there's a huge benefit to bring things together, because by doing that, you also move them up in the policy agenda, right? Because when you have a partnership that does climate and says, actually, we are also addressing gender, then that moves up into the climate, right? So that's how you basically make sure that those things are realized. So I do see some potential there, but that's why we do this research. It's not self-evident that just by putting everyone together, you get magical outcomes. So it's not like magic beans. It's a lot of buts and ifs and under these conditions and you know, in a sense, complex. That's why it's really important to study it. But so I think that's a great question and one that needs more scrutiny. So it's not per se the solution to everything, but it can be under certain circumstances.
Thank you. I would have a question. You mentioned marginalized groups being underrepresented, like it's single digits for groups like women or farmers or maybe indigenous people. Do you think this has to do with a structural problem of the platform or the way MSPs are constructed, or do you know of any way these marginalized groups could be better represented?
Yeah, thanks. So that data was not referring to this platform. That was research on particularly WSSD partnerships that were mentioned. So it's probably some similarities in what I would just say now. But yes, one reason is that some of those interests are not represented in the same way as the others, right? It's quite easy to find a business association working with a governmental agency, but for the others, it might be a bit more difficult. But I think that's not really the reason. That there are representations of, you know, trade unions, for example, or farmers. They're still not in that original sample, and it's probably quite similar to what we see now. And one of the reasons is that there is contestation in some of those actor groups against this whole idea of partnering. And that's something we haven't really discussed, but I think it's important to bring about. I mean, not everyone agrees with the whole proposition that, you know, partnerships is the magic beans to implement the SDGs. There are, of course, strong voices that say no. Why would we need to sit with government and then the business comes in? Why do we need to do that? Why can't we just sit with governments, or, you know? So I think this debate is playing out in some corners more than others. And if you think about it, for most businesses, being part of anything UN is simply great PR. It's really quite simple as that. For many critical groups, it's not the same, you know. So I think that partially is something we need to take into account. So I do see there's some questions there, some research may be necessary to check how it is in this database and what the reasons are, why this sort of underrepresentation of some of the more critical voices occurs.
Thank you very much. Maike, please.
Yes, thank you. And the question also goes into this direction towards the marginalized groups. And because, of course, there's also a normative reason why these groups and people should be included. But would you say that also from your perspective, would it help to overcome the silos if a more diverse set of actors would be included? Because then more topics would be included and just more voices that connect these topics.
Yeah. That's a good question too. I think there's a difference between connecting sectors. You can do that without a lot of inclusion per se. You just need the right, biodiversity agencies and the right climate groups and so on. But will that solve the problem? And there, I think inclusion is a critical component. So research has shown again and again that more diversity helps actually the quality of governance. So in a very broad sense, I think that's a true statement. So when you improve the diversity and thereby so inclusion in those partnerships, it will eventually be good for the quality. So you can have, let's say, a thin integration where you just make sure that oceans and biodiversity and climate sort of talk to each other, and it's sort of not, detrimental. And you can have a deeper integration where you also make sure you have inclusion by various perspective on the issues, because that will make sure that the issues aren't sort of mainstreamed into, let's say, pricing everything, or like some of those things that we see a lot actually in trying to have one solution for all problems, right? It's all economic externality, so we need to just internalize everything and then everything is fixed. You see, I'm not an economist because they would basically say that. So there might be really a case of benefits of including different voices for the quality of what happens. It doesn't mean it will happen or that it's easy, right? But theoretically, I would agree would be a good idea.
Do we have more questions? Maybe a final one, yeah, or two even. Okay.
Laura, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So mine is a bit about is there any, because the SDG has to be measured and accomplished, and also is this platform part of it? And is there any type of follow-up on the partnerships that are registered there from the UN, or is there any accountability process following this? Thank you.
Yeah, so probably you can guess the answer. But so you're pointing to a really important sort of design flaw that we not only actually see in relation to SDGs, because one thing I should mention, probably you know that, this idea that we bring in all sorts of societal actors to solve all sorts of problems is not just in the SDGs. You have it on the climate, where there's their own platform registered with the UN Secretariat, where there are hundreds of those initiatives. It's now in biodiversity, where we have an action agenda for nature and people, where there's a call for bringing in partnerships. So partnerships are everywhere. And in each of those, so this is SDG platform is one example. They made the same design flaw, I would say, from a scientific perspective. Actually, we have talked about that for years, and that's if you don't define minimum criteria of quality, everyone will just throw their stuff at it and see what sticks. Right? You can register basically now if you want a partnership with the UN platform if you put it in the right boxes. And so there isn't really a strong monitoring, reporting, verification mechanism. There is no minimum criteria, and there's definitely no sticks and carrots in terms of trying to weed out the problematic ones. And problematic, I should say, from my personal perspective, would be green or blue washing initiatives. But there isn't. And the simple answer is that that's not the UN mindset. The UN mindset is basically try to be inclusive and to avoid conflict. Because you would have to have discussions among governments, basically, where you would probably have governments like the Netherlands who say, oh, no, we want to have companies involved because it's just great. And then you would have whatever North Korea saying, no, as a sort of caricature, obviously. But that's a design flaw of those partnerships, that they have not really managed to have, teeth in a sense of controlling. And that's why actually research is so critical, because you could say, why do you go through all this coding? And I mean, why do you do that? And one of the reasons is actually because we don't have good quality data to answer any of the questions that we just raised, because we rely on self-reporting of actors that are self-interested. Even an NGO is self-interested in that respect. And that's why we need extra scrutiny by researchers who might be self-interested as well, but maybe hopefully to a lesser degree. And we can provide some more neutral data to answer some of those questions. Who's involved? Is anyone marginalized? How inclusive is it? Does it work? Who's benefiting? And so on and so on.
Maybe I can add a short thing on that, and that's that this partnerships platform is also, it's not just a thing that they launched and that's it. It has also had multiple iterations. It has had different versions. It has merged pre-existing databases from other places, other platforms that they had, stuff like that. And in one of those iterations, they did give the option when you were registering it to provide follow-ups on your partnership or whatever initiative they were registering. And we see that just from the data that we're currently coding, that some of them have the slot to provide a follow-up or not. And those that do, it's super rare also to find any who would use it, who would actually come back and and say anything about how things are going, because there's zero, because, and it can be many reasons that we can hypothesize about, but I guess one obvious one is that there's no incentive to do that. And so that was one thing I wanted to maybe just give us an insight from what we see. But then also on what Philipp was mentioning, that there's no criteria for joining. I think one example that is now being done differently is this net zero initiatives, where now to join that, then I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think you have to run a little bit of an application for it, where they do have, they do have some criteria, you show how you fulfill those criteria, and then someone decides whether you were going to be added or not. And I think that's definitely much more, at least you know what you're dealing with, with something like that. So maybe we'll see, it may be interesting to compare.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for this very interesting session. In our lecture, Philipp said this the other lecturers emphasized the need for integration, and it's on the one hand very interesting to see that there's one goal of the SDGs really focused on integration, on partnerships. But then it's also, on the other hand, a bit frustrating to see how many shortcomings there are, or obviously more shortcomings than advantages so far. But yeah, as we discussed, and I think maybe even more than it's important to have research on the partnerships. And it was very interesting to see also how, to hear about your methodology, the coding phase, and so on. So thank you so much for these very interesting insights. And of course, I hope, Philipp, that we will have the opportunity to, and also Montserrat, to see you in Berlin too. I told everybody that, Philipp, I didn't know Montserrat before. It was the first time I heard you lecturing, but Philipp is also a very entertaining lecturer, so he can entertain big lecture halls, and now I know you can also entertain Zoom meetings or WebEx meeting. So thank you so much. Maybe you stay all online and we still have a final picture together, but we say goodbye to the live stream and thank you.
Thanks a lot, Lena, also for the opportunity to speak, and thanks, Montserrat, also for joining everyone for your questions. And just if I can say one final thing, I'm frustrated a lot of the times when I do this type of research, in a sense, because you know, of course, you get the impression that nothing works as it could. You know, you're always like sort of underutilizing those things.
Mm-hmm.
But whatever you do in life later, whatever profession you go in, you know, academia, if you work for the government, if you work for an NGO, for business, I mean, that's just the general problem that we have. That in theory, the things look much better, much clearer than they actually look in when you go in the trenches and you talk to people. And I think there's a lot of goodwill also in the UN, in this UN context of partnerships. So not everything is blue washing, not everything is greenwashing, not everyone tries to mess up the planet on purpose. There's a lot of people in this that we also know, that we speak to, that we do interviews, that actually really care about those things. But it takes a lot of effort to make them work. So please don't get cynical because the things don't work. They can work if we really push hard. So it's really important not to lose the face in some of those things. Just as a little closing statement. Thanks, Lena, for having us. Really nice for your questions. Thanks a lot.
So our conclusion is we need more research if things do not work yet. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And let's take a final picture. I think Laura, you're taking it, right? Yeah. Okay. Let's applause first. No. Yeah. There we go. Perfect. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, perfect. I took one.
Okay. Cool. Nice. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks for the questions. Thanks, Emmanuel, for moderating. And see you soon. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.